Shalom and welcome again to another edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm Rabbi Richard Address, a director of Jewish Sacred Aging and the host of these podcasts. Welcome and thank you very much for joining. These podcasts hope to explore issues related to our own aging and the implications of longevity for our families, our communities, and ourselves. And we welcome your comments and suggestions. Feel free to contact me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com, or you can visit our website, jewishsacredaging.com, or like us and visit the Facebook page. And we thank you for that. And it is with great pleasure that we welcome to this edition of Seekers of Meaning, Joshua Greene, the author of a brand new, recently published book called Unstoppable. On every bookstore and obviously on the great God Amazon. I'm sure you've seen some of the advertisements for it. The book is Unstoppable, the really story of Siggi B. Wilzig, who is a fascinating, absolutely fascinating true story that Josh has written about. So first of all, Josh, thank you for joining us. Welcome, and how are you? How are you feeling?
I'm well, thank you. Pleasure to be here with you today.
I'm very happy. We have so much to cover. This is a very, very fascinating book, very timely. Deborah Lipstadt writes in the introduction about the fact of the timeliness of this, because so much of the Holocaust generation we are now losing. And the story really is a mirror of, in many ways, quote, the American dream, but it's much more than that. This man is a fascinating character. So if you were stuck at like a cocktail party, or you had and Siggi is right next to you and you wanted to introduce him, how would you introduce this man?
I'd say, let me introduce you to the person who obliged me to rethink my approach to Holocaust testimony. My good fortune has been to study under the scholars and experts at the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University, which is one of the oldest such archives in the world. And the approach there is to allow the survivors and witnesses to tell their experiences in their own words without interference by the people conducting those discussions. The witnesses are the experts in their own life's story. And for the longest time, that approach, as critical as it is to an unblemished understanding of survivor experience, also imposes a kind of restraint in that the person conducting those discussions is expected to not interfere with any redemptive agendas or an attempt to skew out some salutary meaning from survivor testimony. And that was, for me, a very depressing experience. Prior to this book, I suppose I'd done a dozen or so biographies of adult men, women, and children who came out of the Holocaust era. And my wife saw me stumbling around the house with my chin on the ground and said, you got to find something else to write about. So I did. I wrote a biography of the late Beatle George Harrison, and that was fun. That was a lot different.
Yeah, I imagine so.
But I wasn't expecting to find relief, if you will, until the phone rang one day about 8 years ago, and it was Siggi Wilzig's son, Ivan. I didn't know it at the time, who said, I've read some of your books, and I think you're the person who should write my father's story. And he told me a little about his father, and I did some research and decided, this is a story that needs to be told. Why does it need to be told? Because Siggi Wilzig embodied the kind of personal qualities that I strive for in my own life. A kind of love of every moment, despite the sadnesses that the world can impose on us. A sense of humor. My gosh, did he have a sense of humor. A belief in the Almighty, despite the evidence that suggests maybe there isn't an Almighty. And perhaps more than anything else, someone who demonstrated that we can always find a thread. There's always something that's there. And if you don't succumb to the despair, you'll find that thread. Can I tell you a Siggi Wilzig story here? I think this'll help. It was January 1945, and the operators of Camp Auschwitz heard the Russian army coming from the east and realized they had to leave. So they gathered up the few thousand remaining prisoners from Auschwitz and marched them from Poland to camps deeper inside Nazi Germany. And Siggi was among them. It was bitter cold, and needless to say, they only had threads to wear. His shoes had fallen apart because in the snow and sleet and slush, the shoelaces had dissolved. If he lost his shoes, he would die because he would get frostbite, and his body had no strength to fight that kind of infection. Well, what to do? What did he have? In his pocket, he had a spoon, which is all that remained of whatever he could bring with him from the camp. And when the guards bedded the prisoners down for the night, he looked around and saw a little slim tree, a sapling, a birch tree. Went over when everyone was sleeping and not looking, and took the edge of his spoon and cut strips of bark from the edge of the tree and braided them together and very carefully tied them around his shoes and got up and tried them. And sure enough, they held. His life literally was spared by a thread of bark. And later, when he was interviewed and he told this story, he said, I survived not because I was a genius, not because I had a lot of education. I didn't have any. It was the hand of God. So despite everything, I think he would want your listeners to know, don't give in to the despair. There's a lot of reasons to despair just now. But if you don't give in to that and you recognize that life is such a blessing, you will find a thread. It'll always be there for you.
It's important for people to understand that this book really is very Jewish in the sense that there's hope. I mean, the story they're just telling, but throughout the book, even with some of the mishigas that he had later on with the financial stuff, there's this layer of hope that is evident throughout the book. And you talk about his lack of formal education, but yet he was a genius in many ways. There's a very, very powerful paragraph that you write towards the end of the book. And I'm going to quote ask your response. You say, for someone whose formal education ended with grade school, Siggi had an uncanny ability to understand complex financial formulas and translate them into action. He was a self-made man with a laser focus who could study obstacles from unusual angles and find innovative, unexpected ways around them. Then he reached out to the people he trusted most, those who had formal training he lacked, to get his plan implemented. That's in many ways an MBA in organizational management, exactly how you describe. But he used that through the camps, didn't he? I mean, that seems to be part of his ability to survive. This, as you say, this uncanny knack to be able to see things that other people didn't see. Could you just elaborate on that?
Sure. From a very young age, he was obliged to live like an adult, even as a child, because the Jew haters in Koryanka, West Prussia, where he grew up, would chase him around. And at one point, two kids picked him up and held him over a meat grinder, threatening to grind him into Jew meat, they called it. So he didn't hang out with the kids very much. He would go and see the adults in action. He would watch them conduct their business negotiations. He'd watch them play cards. He'd study their strategies. From age 5 or 6, he was learning how to get along, how to survive. And his expertise was getting to the heart of someone's motives. He was an amazing judge of character. If someone were to come up to him, within 30 seconds, he could scope them out. He could figure out what they were motivated by, what they were looking for, and if he could trust them or not. He had a device when he came to America and he was building his empire. I mean, here's a guy who showed up with $240. By the time he was done, he had a banking and oil empire with assets of more than $4 billion. Okay, just to give you an idea. He had a device. If you walked into a business meeting and he sensed that little anti-Semitic vibe in the room, he would roll up his sleeve and he'd point to his prisoner number tattooed on his arm, and he'd shake a finger at them and say, the last person to try to intimidate me was Hitler, and he didn't succeed, and neither will you. And he would walk out and then beat them at their own game, usually.
No, I know that style you write about it. It's a fascinating scene that you portray in the book about him rolling up his sleeve and just having people look at the tattoo. When he comes to America and begins his journey towards his eventual, adulthood and success, he makes himself three promises that you write about, which are fascinating. That he would never go hungry again, that he would marry a Jewish woman and have children and help rebuild the Jewish people, and lastly, he would preserve Holocaust memory, etc. As Lipstadt points out in the beginning of your book, this generation is leaving us. How concerned are you as a biographer, as a person who's studied this and written about these people, that eventually this memory, this impact, this moment in history is going to be relegated to a page in a history book and people will forget?
Yeah. Well, how concerned? I don't think I could be more concerned. I've had the very troubling experience of teaching at universities on an undergraduate level. And the kind of questions that young people ask are stunning. They'll say things like, what did the Jews do on weekends in the camps? Or I had one young man ask me, was the food kosher? Did they let them go home for holidays? The degree of ignorance is leaves you speechless. And you're quite right. We're rapidly approaching the time when the Holocaust will become another artifact of ancient history, like the French Revolution or the Roman Empire or whatever. And that's very dangerous. I think if Siggi were here, he would say to every one of your listeners, study the Holocaust and teach the Holocaust. Teach it to young people, teach it in high schools, teach it in colleges, teach it to your family, teach it everywhere. Because if you lose track of the Holocaust, you leave the door open for the worst kind of darkness to penetrate. You may remember, Rabbi, the footage of the people storming the Capitol building on January 6th, and that guy with the words Camp Auschwitz emblazoned on his sweatshirt.
It was hard to miss. It was hard to miss.
I mean, racism and anti-Semitism didn't die with Hitler in his bunker. They're alive and doing quite well. And they're at the heart of the bitterness and the violence and the anger that we've seen in our country in recent months and years. It's critically important that we never lose sight of the Holocaust.
Do you think there's just what you're saying just triggered a question that I've had this conversation sometime with colleagues and people in congregations, but do you think that now this is, it's just too painful for some generation, the younger generations, to even discuss that there's no sense of reality? I mean, I'm concerned that nobody reads history anymore, or that nobody understands history anymore. And, history is a 30-second soundbite on the news or TV, but nobody really delves into the realities of history, because we've been down this road before in many cases. And the reason why I bring this up is because towards the end of the book, you have this quote from a sign that Siggi had in his office, which read, "Free men who forget their bitter past do not deserve a bright future." And as I'm reading that, and then at the same time watching the news, and I'm thinking to myself, he had it right. He had it right. How dangerous are we that we don't understand or read history?
Well, look, we're raising a generation of viewers, not readers. You know, people, young people in particular, but I think more or less, our entire culture in this country is geared more toward having their history synthesized, distilled down, simplified, made digestible in a 90-minute film that you can sit and watch with a bowl of popcorn, and having to go to the inconvenience of reading the books. Who has time to read Yehuda Bauer or any of the other scholars of Holocaust history who write 600, 700, 800-page tomes? We don't have the patience for that anymore. So when you try to distill down, my friend Larry Langer, who is one of the great scholars in the area of survivor testimony, once described it this way. He said, "The Holocaust has been reduced to a name, a place, and a number. The name is Mengele, the place is Auschwitz, and the number is 6 million. And that's all that people know. And beyond that, we don't have time for it. We don't have the patience for it." Some people may say also they've reached their limits. They have Holocaust fatigue. They don't want any more Holocaust. There's been so much Holocaust. Do we really need to know more about it? And the question that I ask is, what do you know about it? What have you understood about the Holocaust? And the answer is tragically little. Teachers face this all the time. They're given a week or so to teach the Holocaust, and then you're off to studying English or mathematics or some other subject. How do you distill the universe that was the Holocaust into a 5-day week? Well, you can't. So we're confronting an ignorance of the single most critical event in recent human history. Siggi dedicated his life to Holocaust education, and this was why. He gave a lecture once at West Point. He was the first Holocaust survivor to be invited to address the cadets and the officers at the U.S. Military Academy. The first thing he said to them was, "When I was growing up, seeing people in uniforms was a cause for fear." He said, "So I'm particularly grateful to be speaking with you today, because one of you someday may become president of the United States." Now, he was aware that the West Point Military Academy was the institution from which many senators and governors and congresspeople and presidents and generals graduated. So his message was, one day, one of you may be president, and therefore you must understand about the Holocaust so that you can read the symptoms and be prepared to prevent it ever happening again. And he used every opportunity. I marvel. He really did take my breath away. The more I learned about this man, the more inspired I became to double my efforts at encouraging Holocaust remembrance.
Would you say that, and you read about this in the book, that his involvement with the creation of the National Holocaust Museum could be considered his crowning achievement?
Well, I think there are people who would agree with that statement. The most important Holocaust memorial museum archive in the world on the Mall in Washington, D.C., they were having some real problems when the project of the museum was first established. There were many questions. It was not clear how this should be undertaken. Should it be a Jewish museum, namely closed on the Sabbath? Should the words of Adolf Hitler be chiseled on the walls, or the words of Anne Frank? Should it be exclusively the experience of the Jews during World War II, or should the theme of the museum be expanded to include other genocides? That was a big issue. You may be aware of the fact that there are Holocaust centers, study centers, memorial centers, that in recent years have changed their name. They're now Holocaust and Genocide Studies Centers, or Holocaust and Human Rights Centers. The idea being to broaden the scope away from the Jewish specificity of the Holocaust, as though studying the Holocaust on its own terms as a Jewish experience is insufficient. Well, I believe that it is sufficient. And I ask why it is that when a university establishes, let's say, a department of African American studies, you don't hear anybody standing up and saying, if we're going to study African American history, we should include the history of the Italian Americans. Let's include the history of the Irish Americans. Somehow, when it comes to the Holocaust, that concern over the Jewish core of this event is something to be broadened and made more comprehensive and universalized. Siggi fought against that. He fought very hard that how far is it going to go before the Jewishness of the Holocaust is lost altogether? The Holocaust was not an example of some bigger theme, man's inhumanity to man, genocide. The Holocaust was a particular event that needs to be examined for what it was, namely the systematic, state-sponsored, scientifically designed murder of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and their allies. That's what the Holocaust was.
You write also about an incident that I will probably bet that the majority of people in the pews of American synagogues really just have no knowledge of, and that's the Evian Conference, which was really, in reading it, you're just struck by the fact that, oh my God, we haven't really learned anything. So could you just walk us through that section of the book and how important that conference was?
Well, there are two schools of thinking. One is called intentionalist, and the other we might call situationalist. The intentionalist school says that it was Hitler's intention from the outset to destroy the Jewish people. The other perspective says that Hitler just wanted to rid Germany of the Jewish people, and when the war came along, he saw an opportunity to take that situation and use it as a foundation for destroying the Jewish people. Well, at one point, it became clear that the opportunity was too good to resist. And there was a gathering of leaders of the Nazi Party at Evian, which is this very lovely kind of a spa town on a lake. And a vast majority of the people in attendance were lawyers and judges. This is what's most interesting about the Evian Conference. How easy it was for the German judiciary, lawyers and judges who had sworn an oath to uphold a democratic republic, to play ball and give Hitler the imprint of legal justification, that now these policies are legal. And it was determined at that conference that there should be a final solution to the Jewish problem. Here we see the cleansing of language that goes on. It wasn't called, the mass murder of Jews. It was called the final solution to the Jewish problem. And at that point, a tally was made, and the number 6 million came out of that tally. It was a math problem for them. How many Jews from this country? How many Jews from that country? And Siggi tells the story because, I'm sorry, I'm confusing things. That was at Wannsee. The Evian Conference, forgive me, I'm getting my conferences mixed up here. At
It's
the
easy
Evian Conference, it's easy to do. At the Evian Conference, the question was, which nations, where I
right.
really did get these mixed up, which nations will accept Jews as a way of harboring them from a dire fate inside Nazi Germany? So England made an excuse why they could only accept a few. France made an excuse. The French, the French government said, we won't take the Jews because if we take the Jews, they'll be willing to work for less money. And therefore, the anti-Semites in France will be even more angry with them because they'll be losing their jobs to the Jews. Anyway, in the back of the room, there were some Germans present, and they gave themselves away because they started laughing. They started laughing at these thin excuses that the various nations were giving for not accepting Jews, not harboring Jews from their fate in Germany. I apologize for confusing those two conferences. Anyway,
No,
maybe
but
the other description was of use as well.
no, but both conferences point out something again. That the fact that we still haven't learned. I mean, there's still nations who are arguing over who to take in and how many in people in dire straits, and the ability to massage language to allow you to do what you want to do, but couch it in legal terminology. We're living that in this country. So again, the idea of not understanding history comes back to bite us in a variety of different ways and places. Siggi had these. I mean, you talk about the West Point speech. He also had this encounter with President Reagan over the Bitburg controversy. For some people who are watching or listening, may remember that with President Reagan's trip to Europe. So, how did Siggi get involved with Reagan and the Bitburg controversy?
This was arguably the single most for Siggi the most tragic development since the end of the war. That the President of the United States had agreed to visit a cemetery in Germany where SS officers were buried alongside Wehrmacht, the normal German army officers. His point was that he had wanted to make a demonstration of solidarity with Germany by showing that the Germans, too, after all, were victims of the Nazis. They were fooled by Nazi propaganda, and most of the soldiers buried at Bitburg were young men. And so should we not also somehow honor them as having been victimized by Nazi Germany? It was the SS who ordered the murder of 59 members of Siggi's family. And the idea that, he went on Barry Farber's radio show. Do you remember Barry Farber? He passed away recently. He had, I think, at one point, the most popular radio talk show in America. And he was controversial. He would take on difficult subjects. When he wanted to have a Holocaust survivor on his show, he went to Siggi, whom he had on previously for business and finance-related discussions. And he said, we lucked out when Siggi agreed to appear on the show to talk about this. But it happened just as this announcement had come out that Reagan was going to be visiting the Bitburg Cemetery, and Siggi just could not refrain from talking about how tragic this is. That, if Reagan had been a stupid man, he said, I wouldn't be so concerned. But he's not a stupid man, and he's the President of the United States, and that he should be doing this, validating the SS, honoring the SS by visiting them and placing a wreath at their headstones. He said, I hope this doesn't lead to something much worse. He was very concerned about that. And, but that's the kind of person Siggi was. He had no fear of anyone. He took on the president. He took on the Federal Reserve. At one point, the Fed tried to get him to divest. He had two companies, an oil and gas company and a banking company. So in the late 60s, because of inflation, there was this move to get what they call parent companies, non-banking companies that owned banks, to divest of their banks. The theory being that non-banking people didn't know how to run a bank, and it was jeopardizing the deposits of the bank customers. Siggi's bank was doing extremely well. He had this uncanny intuition for knowing how to invest the resources of his company. So he thought these people don't know what they're talking about, and he refused to accept the mandate to divest. So he was the first person in history to sue the Federal Reserve. You have to imagine, he's this little guy, 5'5". Just to make himself a little taller, he used to coif his hair. He had a big head of hair. He used to make sure it got very, very high. And he used to wear platform shoes just to make himself a little higher. Taking on the institution that is responsible for the finances of the most powerful, wealthiest nation on earth. The board of directors is appointed by the president of the United States, and here he is suing the Federal Reserve. Well, I won't give away the story. I think people should read about it in the book, but it's a fascinating look into the mind of a man who was not intimidated by anything or anyone.
No, that's those parts of the book towards the end are absolutely fascinating to read. There was a big awards dinner that you write about, and there was a statement that Siggi made that I remember as I'm reading the book, I went, holy, wow, clean that up. Where he says he gets this big award, and you write it, people stand up, standing ovation, and you would expect this wonderful speech of, only in America, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he turns around and he says, I'm still in Auschwitz every day. I'm not really liberated. And that's a stopper. Talk to me about that if you can. How is he was never, quote, liberated. He was in Auschwitz every day of his life. Was this the demon that he carried with him, Josh?
Yes, it was. You don't get over the Holocaust. If you're fortunate, you learn how to manage the nightmares. Siggi said to an interviewer from the Shoah Foundation just a few weeks before he passed away. The interview was in the end of 2002. He passed away in January of 2003. He said, I'm going to tell you something I've never said before, and that is I could not live without my nightmares. Now, when Siggi says nightmares, this isn't nightmares like you and I have. This is nightmares where he envisioned his own children walking into the flames of the crematorium ovens. He says, I can't live without the nightmares because they give me an ultra-realistic sense of the miracle of what it means to be alive. He said, especially as a Jew. And he said, I would never want to give that up. There's a tendency on the part of those of us who were not there to want to find some way to prettify the survivor experience by imposing on it a happy ever after ending. Even people who should know better. I'll tell you a story. My first Holocaust film was called Witness Voices from the Holocaust. And it was based on recorded testimonies from the Fortunoff archive at Yale University. And it's a 90-minute feature film where it's just survivors speaking. That's all it is. The head of educational programs at a very prestigious organization here in New York called and said, we'd like to talk with you about your film. So I went in and they said, Professor Greene, you've produced a very powerful film here, but I'm afraid that the way it is now, we can't use it in our programs. Why not? Well, this person said, it's the ending. It's very sad. Could you change that? Now, you can't make this stuff up, right? I mean, this actually happened. even people who should know better have a hard time dealing with the depth and scale of what occurred. So we find some way to make ourselves feel better, right? Jacob the Liar, Life is Beautiful, Inglorious Bastards. The Holocaust becomes a background for creative people to demonstrate their ability to impose some kind of either entertainment value or feel good value of some kind. I mean, even Steven Spielberg, who's this master storyteller, God bless Steven Spielberg for what he's done for the Jewish people. But if you've seen Schindler's List, you have to ask yourself, how many people really believe that at the end of the war, black and white turned to glorious color, and the survivors of the camp linked arms and walked over the hillside singing Israeli folk songs? That's not history. That's Hollywood.
Right. It's
And we
Hollywood.
do that because we want to get up tomorrow morning. So Siggi was, I guess the word that comes to mind is punctilious. He was absolutely uncompromising in the necessity for accuracy in describing the Holocaust. He did not want anything to fuel denial. And I have to tell you, writing his story, thank goodness I had his children there looking over my shoulder, his son Ivan and daughter Sherry in particular. They understood how important it was to their late father that everything be accurate so that nothing becomes questionable. And so they read every line, every paragraph, every page. And the book's the better for it.
So before we conclude, let me just ask you this. It's a great book. It's a wonderful read. It's a tough book because you describe some things in there like the scene with the potatoes in the camp and the poisoned potatoes, and the line he says, "I think I actually killed my father." And what did this do to you? How did the writing of this book and the researching of this man impact your soul, impact your neshama?
Well, you ask for a lot on a first date, don't you, Rabbi?
Yeah, well, I'm from Philly. It's what the heck.
Look, I can give you a simple answer because I don't think we have time for the more complicated answer. The simple answer is it's reminded me how important it is to retain a sense of humor. Siggi was hysterically funny. And one thing that people have pointed out about this book, Unstoppable, is that it's the first time they've read a book that deals with the Holocaust period, and they came away laughing and smiling. So thank goodness it's not because I tried to make the Holocaust funny.
No, right. That's who he was.
But because Siggi came out of this with his sense of humor intact. So it reminded me how important it is. Sure, should we go searching for our neshama? Should we be looking for our spiritual selves? Yeah, but not at the price of our sense of humor. So that was one very important lesson for me.
Were you changed by this?
Yeah. Wow. I think it made me more serious about my own spiritual practices. Let me put it that way. I'm in my family, I'm the guy they always point to and say he's the spiritual one, right? Because I practice yoga and I'm vegan and I chant mantras in the morning, And I think Siggi reminded me that the way you live your life matters.
Yeah.
That, you don't have to become a billionaire to have an impact. Whoever heard of Siggi Wilzig before? Right? He happened to have made amazing achievements and startling accomplishments for someone who arrived here as a 21-year-old immigrant with no education and only $240. But his point is, every one of us has opportunities placed before us. And our job is not to think in terms of becoming billionaires. Our job is to think in terms of the blessings of life and making the most of the opportunities that are presented to us. I think he would want us to remember that.
Joshua Greene, the author of Unstoppable. If you haven't read it, go out and buy it on Amazon, bookstores, etc. Josh, thank you very, very much for your honesty and for the book. And just take care and stay safe and continued success and health. Most importantly, health. And keep that sense of humor.
Thank you.
Thank you. And to all of you, again, thank you for watching and listening to this edition of Seekers of Meaning, the TV show and podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. Remember, it is now available on the Roku streaming service. Again, we welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com, and we invite you again to visit the website, jewishsacredaging.com, and our Jewish Sacred Aging Facebook page. And if you'd like to make a tax-free donation to help support the work of Jewish Sacred Aging, please go to the website and click on the conveniently located donate button. Seekers of Meaning is produced by the Broadcast Center of Lubetkin Media Corporation here in beautiful, sunny today, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and a big shout out to our producer, Steve Lubetkin. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address. I look forward to greeting you on our next Seekers of Meaning TV show and podcast. In the meantime, stay safe, everybody. Stay healthy. Take care. Shalom.